Why did the one-handed man cross the street?
Why?
To get to the second-hand store. Welcome to Adaptable,
The show where we debate whether the movie or book is better.
I'm Will.
I'm Beth, and today we will be discussing
Never Let Me Go. Before we get to the debate, let's talk about plot.
This episode will not be spoiler-free.
It begins at Hailsham Academy with three students, Ruth, Tommy, and Kathy.
Narrated by Kathy, the beginning of the story follows the three students in their time at school, where Tommy struggles with anger management, Kathy with having a mind of her own, and Ruth with self-confidence that manifests in manipulative behavior.
Things start to get complicated as the students slowly realize that they are in fact clones being cultivated for their organs.
In the second part of the book, when the students are teens, they move to the cottages where a messy love triangle ensues. Tommy and Ruth end up together, and Kathy feels generally abandoned.
After leaving the cottages, the three friends are separated. The final part of the book follows Kathy as she attempts to reconnect with Ruth and Tommy in the final stages of their lives as donors.
Kathy and Ruth try to make amends, while Kathy and Tommy try to make up for lost time. All while Kathy has to watch Ruth and Tommy slowly die.
Today, I'll be defending the book.
I'll be taking the movie.
Since the book came first, you have somewhere you need to be? The book is much better, and here's why. For my first point, I want to talk about Kazuo Ishiguro, one of the greatest novelists of the last 100 years. In 2017, he was given the Nobel Prize in Literature. People like to talk about his use of narrative, the emotional force of his work, the relevant themes that he uses. Themes of this book intersect with themes of his other books. They're deepened, re-examined. Remains of the Day is probably his most famous book. Remains of the Day deals with enormous questions like how do we live an ethical life, or how do we make sense of our lives when it seems like they're meaningless, or like we've missed our opportunity to make the most of what we've been given. Never Let Me Go takes the arguments of Remains of the Day and gives them a new flavor, a new context, a more modern situation that makes them more relevant to a whole generation of readers. My second point builds on the first. Narrative and narrative style become increasingly important as we follow Kathy, who gives a first-person account of the time at Hailsham, the time in the cottages, and the later years as she watches her friends approaching death. At Hailsham, art is extremely important. One of the major themes of the book is the capacity of art to determine whether we have a soul. Some of the more radical teachers at Hailsham are trying to convince the world that these students are in fact more than clones by collecting their art and putting it on display before the world. We never get to see any of this art except for one piece. That is Kathy's book, which she writes at the end of her life. We have this whole meta concept of Kathy presenting her art to us to evaluate whether or not she has a soul, or whether her friends have a soul, or whether that question is even relevant to ask. In this way, we get to participate with the teachers of Hailsham and with the citizens of Britain as they try and make sense of these clones and whether or not they are in fact human beings. The third reason this book is good is the way the author uses time. Because Kathy is writing her own book years in the future, the author is able to weave together different events from the past, from different periods at Hailsham, at the cottages, or in the years leading up to the death of her friends. In this way, the reader can be disoriented and brought into this sort of mystery of this woman's experience. The author is able to create a tapestry of perspectives, calling to question the validity of different memories and the validity of different experiences throughout that journey. And that's why you'll never want to let this book go.
Boo! develop a lot of the interpersonal relationships. There are a lot of key moments between the characters, sideways glances, concerned looks, particularly between the love triangle, that are really key to developing the storyline. This is really particularly important with our teenage years, where teenagers have a lot of sass towards each other and a lot of unspoken dialogue. Additionally, it's particularly helpful with Kathy, who's not necessarily the most reliable narrator, who doesn't seem to always pick up on social cues that are particularly important to following the plot of the story. It allows us to follow what is happening around her as well as how she's feeling about it, rather than trying to rely on what she thinks she's perceiving. Secondly, at Hailsham, the students are expected to present art at a gallery which gets sold so that they can go shopping for secondhand items. At the secondhand item store in the movie, it is very clear the contrast between the sad items that they are purchasing and how truly secondhand they are, with the excitement that the students are feeling because they don't know any different. In addition, you get to see the discomfort from all of the adults who know better, in contrast to the students, which gives you an earlier sense of how uncomfortable and how off Hailsham truly is. Finally, there is a large plot point around the idea that Tommy is bullied as a weird child with a lot of anger management issues when he is younger. Later on, Ruth's attraction to him, and additionally Kathy's attraction to him, is particularly jarring after getting that set up for a character. In the movie, you get to see that Tommy is not actually that weird, but we are dealing with a lot more social anxieties in the weird setting, rather than setting up Tommy from Kathy's perspective as a uncomfortable individual. In conclusion, the movie is better because it gives you a better sense of the world that isn't affected by a questionable narrator.
Are you sure you're not a questionable narrator? From the beginning, even though Kathy's unreliable, we get the whole perspective. It's just much more subtle. It draws the reader in and requires the reader to question what they're being given in the same way that these kids are being called to question their own lives.
But if you can't follow the plot, then you aren't able to follow the questions that the book is trying to lead you to.
I think that might be a you problem. I think all the material is there, it just takes a little bit more effort. I mean, I think it's fair that the movie makes more explicit a lot of these subtleties in the book, but I think in making it
With
explicit,
a
lot faster pacing, but it turns these really nuanced concepts into foghorns, you know, where it's just screaming at the reader.
Yes.
These kids are weirdos.
If we're going to talk about a questionable society and a large, heavy topic like that, I feel like to live in nuances pushes you away from that conversation, because first we have to have the conversation of, did we interpret the book correctly?
Well, that's, honestly, I think that's the point though, because when you get to the end of the book and the end of the movie, Kathy is unsure whether or not she is so different from the people who she cares for, or so different from the people she donates her organs to. I think ambiguity is itself a central element of the plot, because you're not really sure if they're weirdos or if they're just normal kids who are getting harvested for their organs.
Okay, what about your point about the author? I mean, just because it's a good author doesn't necessarily suggest that it's a good book. And even if you want to argue that it's a good plot, because the book and the movie use the same plot, they didn't stray for this one, just because you have a good plot does not suggest good writing.
I have to admit you're right, that a good author doesn't mean a good book necessarily, but my other 2 points were about the use of narrative and the use of time, which are both extremely difficult to pull off. So I was really just using that to highlight how the author expands the experience of reading the book with his skill, which I think is more than justified.
Speaking of your narrative, the narrative being that we follow 1, 2, 3 locations, which is exactly what the movie does?
No, the book is all over the place. The book is in the future, and then it's in the past, and then they're at the cottage, and she's not sure if they're 8 years old when they find out that they're clones, or if they're 12 years old. But the movie is just one thing after the other, driving on and on, where
the narrative piece, because she's writing this from the future looking back, is what you're...
Exactly. It gives it an added layer of inquiry, of complexity. It allows the author to explore these themes in greater detail from a variety of perspectives, rather than just giving us this very bland, one thing happens after the other type of movie narrative.
Which I will concede, if you were to do in a movie, you would have to do with a monologue over it, or a voiceover to some perspective, which I just think is so cheesy in movies when they try to take that out of the book.
I think that my strongest point is really my second point about the role of Kathy as the narrator. Because it's really a book, a story. It's a story about people trying to make sense of their own mortality, make sense of their place in the world. And with the book, you get to watch somebody doing that. With the movie, yeah, it's beautiful, it's more explicit, but you lose that essential connection.
If you were going to argue from the perspective that we are following along with Kathy and like we are going through the same mental journey that Kathy is going through, you do lose that in a movie. I can't and it's not going to be well recreated in a movie without going hard voiceover or trying to force that same narrative onto it. So if that is the ultimate goal of the plot and the storyline, yes, you will not get that out of the movie version. I think the movie is still going to force you to ask the same questions about the dystopian world we're living in, but I don't think you will get to follow that same journey without following that narrative.
And ultimately that narrative is what makes the book relevant to us and the questions that we face.
Fair. Thanks for watching. Feel free to join the debate in the comments below.
This has been
Adaptable.
I'm Will.
I'm Beth, and today we will be disgusting.
Disgusting.
Dang it.
That's real. I gotta stimulate the energy. What did the kidney say to the liver? I'm out of here.
Did you write that yourself?
The thing about a good pun is that